London's autumn was crisp, the damp streets echoing with the steady clip-clop of horse-drawn carriages. Inside 221B Baker Street, the scent of burning tobacco thickened the air, curling from the pipe held loosely between Sherlock Holmes's fingers. He sat in his usual chair by the window, his sharp eyes scanning the streets below with a distant yet calculating gaze. Dr. John Watson sat across from him, the day's newspaper folded on his lap, though his attention had long since wandered. The room, cluttered with scattered notes, chemical vials, and an open violin case, bore the unmistakable marks of a mind constantly at work. A sharp knock on the door interrupted the silence. Watson glanced up, setting his cup of tea down as Mrs. Hudson entered with a silver tray. On it lay a single envelope, its deep crimson seal unbroken. Without a word, she placed it on the table and left, accustomed to the unspoken routines of the household. Holmes barely moved, only flicking his gaze toward the letter before exhaling a slow stream of smoke. It was a peculiar habit of his, ignoring things until he deemed them worthy of his time. Watson, however, leaned forward, drawn by an unusual detail. The letter carried the faint scent of lilac, a subtle, intentional choice. Holmes eventually reached for the envelope, turning it between his fingers before breaking the wax seal. His expression remained unreadable as he unfolded the neatly penned letter. The handwriting was precise, each word carefully measured. The message was brief, but weighted with urgency. It came from a man of notable standing, Lord Cedric Marlowe, a nobleman with an impeccable reputation. The request was as simple as it was perplexing. A woman, Evelyn Hartwell, had vanished. But before she did, she had taken something that, if revealed, could dismantle his life. Watson observed Holmes closely, searching for a flicker of reaction. The detective merely tapped his fingers against the armrest, his mind already dissecting possibilities. The details were deliberately vague. The woman's disappearance was secondary. It was what she had taken that mattered. Watson suspected. The word scandal lingered between the lines, unspoken yet understood. The address for a meeting was listed, the urgency clear. Yet, Holmes did not move. He let the letter rest on his knee, staring at the flames in the fireplace as though they held the answer. Another knock sounded, and this time, Mrs. Hudson barely had time to step aside before Lord Cedric Marlowe himself entered. His presence filled the room instantly. Tall, well-dressed but fraying at the edges. He was a man used to control, but something in his demeanor betrayed unease. He removed his gloves slowly, his fingers twitching as he placed them on the side table. He hesitated for only a moment before lowering himself onto the chair across from Holmes. Holmes did not greet him. Instead, he observed him, noting every detail. The restless shifting, the way his left hand clenched subtly before releasing, the barely concealed desperation beneath his carefully composed face. Without looking at Watson, Holmes reached for his pipe again, tapping it lightly against the ashtray before finally speaking. He asked why Lord Marlowe believed Evelyn Hartwell had betrayed him. Lord Marlowe straightened, as if insulted by the implication. He explained that Evelyn had not been a mere acquaintance. She had been a confidant, someone he had trusted. Their correspondence had been private, filled with conversations meant for no other eyes. Yet, in a matter of days, she had disappeared, without a trace, taking with her a letter that, should it find the wrong hands, could dismantle his standing in society. Holmes listened, his expression betraying nothing. He asked if Lord Marlowe had attempted to retrieve the letter himself. Marlowe nodded stiffly. He had used all his connections, searched every possible location, yet she had vanished completely. It was as if she had never existed. The only trace left behind was an empty room and the lingering scent of lilac. A silence settled between them. Watson could feel the weight of unspoken questions pressing against the walls of the room. Holmes finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He stated that Lord Marlowe had not been deceived. He had been outmatched. The woman he spoke of had not merely run away. She had orchestrated her departure with precision. This was not a case of simple betrayal. It was something far more deliberate. Lord Marlowe's jaw tightened. He demanded to know if Holmes could find her. Holmes did not answer immediately. He picked up the letter again, running his fingers along its edge before placing it back on the table. He said he would take the case, but warned Marlowe that the answer may not be one he wished to hear. Marlowe stood abruptly, adjusting his coat. He stated that he did not care about the truth. He cared only about retrieving what was his. With that, he left, the door clicking shut behind him. Watson exhaled, only now realizing he had been holding his breath. He asked Holmes if he believed Evelyn had intended to use the letter for blackmail. Holmes merely smiled, a small knowing curve of the lips. He stated that Evelyn Hartwell was not a common thief. She had not taken the letter for wealth. She had taken it because she could. Watson frowned, sensing something deeper beneath the words. He pressed further, but Holmes had already stood, stretching as he moved toward the window. Holmes stated that their next step was to find Evelyn, but they would not do so by chasing shadows. She had left no trace, no misstep. That, in itself, was the first clue. He turned to Watson and stated that they would start where all disappearances begin, not with the one who vanished, but with the ones left behind. Watson nodded, already reaching for his coat. He knew that once Holmes set his mind to something, there was no stopping him. The game had begun, and the woman at the center of it all had just become Sherlock Holmes' most intriguing opponent yet. The investigation into Evelyn Hartwell's disappearance began with the usual inquiries, letters, correspondences, and financial transactions. But wherever they looked, they found no answers. Holmes, uncharacteristically restless, paced the room, muttering to himself as he pieced together fragments of a puzzle that refused to fit. Watson attempted to ground his friend's erratic energy by reviewing what they knew for certain. Holmes exhaled sharply, noting that she had left nothing behind except her name, and even that might be a fabrication. Holmes decided they needed a new approach. He sent out inquiries to his network of informants across London, seeking any trace of Evelyn Hartwell's movements. A message soon arrived from one of his contacts at the docks, claiming that a woman of Evelyn's description had purchased passage on a riverboat, though the details were scarce. Holmes and Watson made their way to the docks, finding themselves surrounded by the heavy scent of brine and the creak of wooden planks underfoot. Holmes questioned the dockmaster, pressing him for more information. The man hesitated, reluctant, to involve himself in the affairs of the wealthy, but under Holmes's scrutiny, he admitted that the woman had not been alone. A gentleman, dressed finely but with an air of secrecy, had accompanied her before she vanished into the mist of the riverfront. Holmes took in the information, his mind racing. If Evelyn had an accomplice, then she had not acted on impulse. Every move had been calculated. Watson watched as Holmes became absorbed in thought, his fingers tapping against the railing as he considered the implications. He turned abruptly and signaled for Watson to follow. They needed to investigate the manor where she had last been seen. As they arrived at the manor, an eerie quiet settled over them. The grand building loomed against the night sky, its windows dark. Holmes approached the door cautiously, pressing a hand against the wood before pushing it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying the scent of parchment and aged wood. They moved through the corridors, their footsteps echoing against the silence. Watson spotted a room with a flickering candle, and they both stepped inside. On the desk sat an envelope addressed to Sherlock Holmes. He hesitated for a brief moment before picking it up and breaking the seal. The note inside was penned with careful precision, each word deliberate. The message stated that he was too late, but his persistence was admirable. The writer claimed to consider this their first dance and ended with a promise of a next time. Holmes read the words twice before placing the letter down. His lips curled into a rare smile as he realized she had anticipated them. She was not running. She was playing. Holmes turned to Watson and gestured toward the letter. This was not an ordinary blackmail or scandal. This was a game of intellect. Evelyn Hartwell had challenged him, and he intended to respond in kind. Watson watched as the fire of pursuit lit in his friend's eyes. They were no longer merely tracking a missing woman. They were engaged in a duel of wits, and Holmes, despite himself, relished the challenge ahead. Days passed, then weeks. Lord Marlowe's desperation grew, but Holmes refused to rush. This was no ordinary case. It was a contest of intellect. And Evelyn Hartwell, it seemed, was a master of the game. Holmes sat in his study, fingers steepled, as he analyzed the details before him. Watson observed his friend, knowing that when Holmes became this silent, it meant something profound was unfolding in his mind. Holmes methodically reviewed every clue, but the patterns remained elusive. He finally stood and paced the room, pausing only when Mrs. Hudson knocked and handed him a small package. The wrapping was fine silk, delicate, yet purposeful. Holmes unwrapped it carefully, revealing an emerald brooch gleaming against the fabric. Watson recognized it instantly as belonging to Evelyn Hartwell. The brooch had once adorned her dress, a signature piece. Lord Marlowe, upon seeing it, confirmed its origins with a grim nod. Holmes studied the brooch, turning it between his fingers before placing it back on the table. This was no ordinary taunt. This was an invitation. He knew he could no longer sit idly by, waiting for Evelyn to make the next move. He decided that they would attend the masquerade ball, the location of which had been subtly indicated by the silk wrapping's embroidery. With Lord Marlowe in tow, they prepared for the evening's event, ensuring that every detail of their presence would be calculated. As they arrived at the grand estate where the ball was being held, the air buzzed with whispered conversations and laughter. The chandeliers cast a golden glow over the sea of masked figures swirling in intricate dances. Holmes scanned the room, his gaze sharp and searching. Among the countless guests, one figure stood out, a woman draped in deep crimson, her gloved fingers delicately wrapped around a glass of wine. She moved with the effortless grace of someone who belonged, yet her posture betrayed her awareness of his presence. Evelyn Hartwell had been waiting for him. Holmes approached, his movements measured. She turned slightly, as if expecting him. A slow smile played across her lips as she watched him. He did not speak immediately, instead allowing the silence between them to stretch, a battle of patience and control. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, amused by the unspoken exchange. Holmes finally acknowledged her presence with a glance before shifting his focus to the letter tucked beneath her sleeve. It was unmistakable. Lord Marlowe tensed beside him, ready to demand its return, but Holmes raised a hand, signaling him to wait. This was not a battle to be won through brute force. This was a game, and Evelyn was playing it masterfully. Evelyn lifted her glass and took a slow sip, her gaze never wavering from Holmes. She acknowledged his presence as though they were old acquaintances rather than adversaries. She let the moment linger before reaching into her sleeve and drawing the letter. She held it delicately between her fingers but did not extend it toward him. Holmes studied her, noting every detail, the way her fingers tightened ever so slightly around, the parchment, the flicker of mischief in her eyes. He knew she was testing him. He took a step closer, lowering his voice to ensure only she could hear him. He questioned her, not with words, but with the weight of his gaze. Evelyn responded by lifting the letter slightly before withdrawing it, once more. Holmes realized then that it was never about the letter itself. It was about the power she held in that moment. Lord Marlowe could no longer contain himself. He demanded to know where the letter had been, why she had taken it, and what she hoped to gain. Evelyn turned her gaze toward him, considering his words, before responding with deliberate slowness. She made it clear that she had never intended to use the letter against him. She had taken it simply because she could, because it was a demonstration of control, of intellect. Holmes understood. This was not about blackmail or vengeance. It was about proving something, perhaps to herself, perhaps to them. Evelyn Hartwell was not a woman to be underestimated. She had entered a world dominated by men, and she had outplayed them all. Without another word, she placed the letter in Holmes's hand, her fingers grazing his briefly before she stepped back. Holmes took the letter, his expression unreadable. Before either he or Lord Marlowe could react further, Evelyn turned and disappeared into the crowd. The scent of lilac lingered in her wake. Holmes remained still for a long moment, watching the space where she had stood. Watson observed him carefully, sensing that this case had affected Holmes in a way few others had. Lord Marlowe clutched the letter tightly, muttering about the ordeal he had endured, but Holmes paid him no mind. Instead, he turned toward the exit, his mind already racing ahead. Evelyn Hartwell had won this round, but Holmes knew the game was far from over. In the weeks that followed, Holmes spoke little of Evelyn Hartwell. The case, in its technical sense, had been resolved. Lord Marlowe had his letter. The scandal was averted. And yet, Holmes remained restless. He spent long hours seated in his chair, fingers steepled, staring at nothing in particular. Watson observed the change in him, noting the way he retreated into long stretches of silence. His violin remained untouched, his chemical experiments abandoned mid-process, the usual air of sharp calculation dulled by something intangible. He continued his daily routine, analyzing newspapers, making observations, but Watson could sense the absence of his usual enthusiasm. He stood by the window more than usual, watching the world move beyond Baker Street as if waiting for something, or someone, to reappear. Watson attempted to distract him, bringing up the details of other cases that had come their way. Holmes barely responded. He either dismissed them outright or engaged only briefly before withdrawing once more into contemplation. He examined the letter from Evelyn Hartwell several times, his fingers running over the precise handwriting, his eyes searching for something hidden between the strokes of ink. Watson had seen Holmes unravel the most complex of puzzles, but this was something different. This was not about mere deduction or the thrill of unraveling deception. This was about the fact that, for once, Sherlock Holmes had been outmaneuvered. 1. Evening, as the gaslights flickered against the cold London air, Watson found Holmes standing by the window yet again. Holmes remained still, his sharp profile outlined against the dim glow of the street lamps. Watson hesitated before speaking, then asked if Holmes believed Evelyn would return. Holmes did not answer at first. He continued to gaze outward, his mind evidently moving through endless calculations and considerations. After a moment, he finally responded with a measured certainty that Evelyn Hartwell was neither an adversary nor an ally. She was something else entirely, an anomaly in a world he thought he had fully understood. Watson turned the words over in his mind, recognizing the rare trace of admiration in his friend's voice. He considered the possibility that Holmes had not merely been bested, but that he had encountered someone who played by entirely different rules. He asked Holmes what Evelyn truly was, if not an opponent or a friend. Holmes shifted his gaze back, to the street, a rare contemplative expression crossing his features. He acknowledged that she was the one who had won, but there was no bitterness in his tone, only quiet respect. Watson did not press further. He knew Holmes well enough to recognize when words could not fully capture what had transpired. The days continued, but the presence of Evelyn Hartwell never truly faded. Holmes resumed his work with renewed vigor, taking on new cases, solving them with his usual precision. He returned to his habits of meticulous observation, his sharp deductions once again commanding attention. And yet, every so often, he would pause mid-thought, his fingers briefly hovering over the edges of an old case file before setting it aside. He never spoke of her again, but Watson knew that the memory of their game, their chase, remained ever present in Holmes's mind. The world moved on, but some mysteries did not fade. And so Evelyn Hartwell became a legend, a ghost of intellect and intrigue, the woman who outplayed the great Sherlock Holmes. Somewhere in some distant corner of the world, she continued to exist beyond reach, beyond expectation, leaving behind only the lingering scent of lilac and the knowledge that, for once, Holmes had been the one left chasing shadows.